Okay, good morning everybody. I'm Adrian Duckenfield, Sales Engineer for UK and Ireland. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we're going to be talking about the history of ransomware and how it's evolved over time. And also we're going to discuss the kind of things we can do to try and prevent it from coming through. And these are all things that we can all do ourselves. Okay, let's get this going. So firstly, what is ransomware? So ransomware is a nasty type of malware that restricts access to either the infected computer or for some of its files. Then it demands that the user pays a ransom to the malware operator to remove that restriction. Now, some forms of ransomware systematically encrypts files on the system's hard drive, which becomes incredibly difficult or impossible to decrypt without paying the ransom for the encryption key to decrypt the files back again. Whilst others simply lock the system and displays a message intending to coax the user into paying. Ransomware typically propagates as a Trojan whose payload is disguised as a legitimate file, like for example, perhaps a Word file or an Excel or a PDF, just to name a few. Now, there are many different forms that ransomware can come in. So I've listed a few here on the screen. So first off, we've got scareware. Now, scareware is a type of malware that is designed to trick the victims into purchasing and downloading basically potentially useless information or useless data, which could potentially also be dangerous. So scareware typically generates like a pop-up that resembles something like a Windows message. Usually it's pretending to be something like antivirus or anti-spyware software, perhaps even a firewall application or maybe a registry cleaner. Then locking ransomware. Now this is very common, a very type of common computer infection that will completely lock you out from accessing your computer until you pay the fine to the cyber criminals. This ransomware pretends to be a lock screen that's placed on your computer by maybe the Department of Justice or the Homeland Security or even the FBI. And it states that it's detected something on your computer which has been involved in illegal cyber activity. It also states that you're going to face a fine of something like $250,000 or even imprisonment from like 4 to 30 years unless you pay the fine. And the amount is usually something like £150, $300, something like that. And you would pay it using something like a money pack voucher. And then we've got MBR ransomware. So MBR stands for Master Boot Record. And the Master Boot Record is the first sector on your hard drive. Without an active MBR, not only will your drive not boot, but it's very difficult to actually get the machine to do anything at all. Now, the beauty of this type of malware is that it runs before the operating system has loaded. And this means that the malware can execute long before antivirus. Therefore, it cannot be detected or prevented. This malware overwrites the original master boot record, and it demands a ransom to retrieve a password and restore your original MBR. Now, obviously, the victim does not know the ransomware password. So after usually 3 incorrect attempts, the infected machine will reboot and the same message will appear again and again and again. Now, fortunately, the hard drive or the files on the drive are not encrypted, as the malware author claims. So this ransomware, it only actually overwrites the MBR, the master boot record. Now, this means that you could actually retrieve your important files back from the drive. Then really you could just wipe your hard drive, reinstall the operating system and copy your files back again. So although it's a complete pain, at least you do have the option to retrieve your data, unlike most other types of ransomware. Then in 2012, we began to see multiple instances of police-themed ransomware. Now, this stuff cunningly disguises their ransom demands as official-looking warning messages from your local law enforcement. The language used and the specific authority mentioned, it will vary depending on the user's geographical location. Most of the police-themed ransomware we've seen so far has been targeted at Western European countries, people like France, Germany, Italy, Finland, places like that. But it's not uncommon to see this all over the world. And then we have SMS ransomware. So SMS ransomware, it's kind of like a Trojan that locks you out of your desktop. So you're unable to access your computer in any way whatsoever. Now, when the Trojan runs, it's going to display a message that says something like, to unlock your machine again, you need to send a text with a unique code to this particular number. And then the idea is that the number you send the text to is a premium rate number. So that text message is going to cost you a lot of money. Now, they would then send you the instructions on to remove the Trojan and gain access to your machine again. Apparently. Obviously, there's no guarantee any of these guys would do those things. Then finally, we move on to crypto style of ransomware. So crypto ransomware, again, it's a Trojan, which is targeted at computers usually running Microsoft Windows. And it's usually delivered in the form of an attachment. Now, when it's activated, the malware encrypts certain files stored on your local and network drives. Then with a private key stored only on the malware command and control servers, the malware is then going to display a message which offers to decrypt the data if payment is made by the stated deadline. And then it threatens to delete that private key if the deadline is passed. Okay, so let's actually see how ransomware has evolved over time. The first documented example of ransomware was actually back in 1989, and it was called the AIDS Trojan, also known as PC Cyborg Cooperation. Now, Harvard-trained evolutionary biologist Joseph L. Popp, he actually sent 20,000 infected floppy disks labeled AIDS Information Introductory Diskette. And these were sent to the attendees of the World Health Organization International AIDS Conference. Once they ran the disk, the malware was installed. Now, the way it worked was after about 90 reboots, the Trojan hid directories and it encrypted the names of the files on those customers' machines. To regain access, the users would have to send $189 to PC Cyborg Corporation at a post office box in Panama. It was said that the proceeds would go to AIDS research, but frankly, there was no evidence of this. Dr. Popp was eventually caught, but he was never tried for his scheme as he was declared unfit to stand trial. His attorney said he started actually wearing things like cardboard boxes on his head to protect himself from radiation poisoning. The case was thrown out of court, and once Dr. Popp actually made it back to the US, he actually became a very successful businessman. In regards to getting rid of the AIDS virus, it really actually wasn't that difficult. The encryption methods used at the time were very, very weak, and they were fairly easy to get around. In fact, I think there was actually an application out there called AIDS Out, which would restore your files back to the way they were. By today's standards, this malware would be easily detected and easily removed. So I've got a couple of interesting points on this before we move away. He sent out those 20,000 disks, but not one of them was sent within the US. They all went to external countries. At the time, it was Scotland Yard's biggest cyber investigation. After this all came back and he came back to the US and became the businessman, he actually went on to create a butterfly conservatory in New York with his daughter. In court, he acted so crazy that he was poisoned. He wore condoms on his nose, a cardboard box on his head, and he had hair curlers in his beard, all in an attempt to prevent radiation poisoning. So he gives the impression that he's completely mental, but actually in his digital diary, it showed that he had planned all of this 1.5 years in advance. So you can make up your own minds, but I clearly think he wasn't quite mental. Then there was this formal encryption had never been used in any attack other than that. So this paper here kind of proposed that it could be. Now, there really isn't much evidence of any further ransomware until 1996. And now at this time, this paper was released by a pair of university computer security researchers that documented that a virus could use private key crypto techniques. Now these guys, they managed to use the latest modern crypto techniques to create a small packaged virus that could easily be transmitted over an email, for example. This was purely done as an experiment, but little did they know what they had begun. Some 15 years after the release of the AIDS virus, we see another example of ransomware, and this one's called PGP Coder. So PGP Coder, or GP code, it was a Trojan that encrypted certain files on the infected computer, and then it would ask for a ransom in order to release those files. Once installed, the Trojan would create two registry keys. One was to ensure that it runs on every single system startup, and the second was to monitor the progress of the Trojan, counting the number of files that have been analyzed by the malicious code. Once run, it's set to work encrypting all of the files that it had found on the computer's drive with extensions corresponding to those listed within its code. And these extensions would include things like doc files, HTML, zip files, JPEGs, Excel, and RAR files. Then the blackmail is actually completed with the Trojan dropping a text file in every directory with instructions to the victim on what they need to do. An email address is supplied through which the users are supposed to request for their files to be released after paying the ransom. And the ransom is usually something like £50, £100, something like that. And the payment will be sent to like an eGold or a Liberty Reserve account. Now, initially, there was only very small infection rates, and mostly this was done in Russia. It was targeting Russian businesses like banks and real estate and other financial institutions. Early encryption issues allowed for the files to actually be recovered. So for example, you could use undelete software to kind of help restore your files again. Now by 2010, GPG code had spread all around the world, and by now it's beginning to use better encryption techniques. However, Kaspersky at the time began to fight back, and they actually managed to crack some of the GPG code encryption. So this takes us from 89 up to 2005. Now from 2010 onwards, we really begin to see an explosion of ransomware as more and more attacks get on board and the tools become easier to obtain. Not to mention encryption methods are becoming much harder to crack. Now today, ransomware can be repackaged and it can be redistributed within something like a 2-hour window. The tools used are easily available online, which makes producing ransomware so much easier and significantly cheaper than it ever has been before. With that in mind, the attackers can create ransomware with a cheaper cost of infection. This means that there's more money for them to make. Now this graph here provided by McAfee, it really demonstrates the acceleration of growth in the amount of ransomware variants, and this is just Q4 2014. But this sudden spike, this sudden jump, it really proves that ransomware is becoming more and more popular, and that it can only be because it's so effective. With the tools being easier to obtain and cheaper to produce, ransomware just begins to evolve at a really fast pace. Okay, so let's see how ransomware has actually evolved. Now, in 2012, Reveton became a great example of ransomware that leaves your data intact, but it's going to lock you out of your computer. And then it's going to demand a fee to let you back in again. Now, it would use a pop-up window that tends to say something like, we have detected piracy, or perhaps we have detected child pornography. And then it's going to state that if you don't pay the fine, which ranged somewhere from usually £100 to £500, then we're going to come after you. Now, when this ransomware first started, it was very basic and it only presented one generic message that could be sent out to every country. But over time, they got really, really good at customizing and targeting policeware based upon your location. And this was done using tools such as GeoIP localization. This means that if you're in the US, you would get an FBI themed message. If you're in the UK, you might get a Scotland Yard message. Now, producing a message that is themed upon your local authority really pushes a sense of fear into the unsuspecting eye. And to make it even worse, they would also include other information like your IP address and even your computer name. And this would, again, it would install that sense of fear that they actually know where you are. Then in some really extreme examples of this malware, believe it or not, they would actually activate your webcam. They would take a photo of you and then place your photo on the message on the screen. I know it sounds surreal, but if you don't know anything about ransomware and you receive something like this as an end user, you're bound to pay it. Now, there are several ways of paying the fine using online services, such as things like PaySafeCard or Ucash or MoneyPack. Now, if you haven't heard about these services before, all you really kind of need to know about them is that they are anonymous. Money transferred via these services cannot easily be traced, so these mechanisms are absolutely perfect for ransomware creators. There are many ways that Reveton spread, but mostly it was sent over email. Other examples were downloaded as botnets when you go to maybe a drive-by website, or you go to a website and the first thing that happens is the botnet is downloaded to your machine, and that's in order to link you back to their network. Once linked, not only can they see what's on your machine, but they can now also push other forms of malware to you, such as ransomware. Ransomware is a very common secondary payload when you get a botnet. These days we see a lot of botnets trying to push this kind of ransomware to people's machines, and the malware has evolved in an effort to try and modernize itself. It's not uncommon now to see it also install other pieces of software, such as Bitcoin miners, in order to try and make even more money from using your machine. The next evolution in ransomware is Cryptolocker. Now, with Cryptolocker, we're switching back to crypto-style ransomware, and we're moving away from the locking ransomware, which we've seen in the older variants of ransomware like the policeware. I think most of us these days have heard about this one. It's made it onto the news fairly often, with some pretty well-known businesses becoming infected. This is really the type of malware that really put ransomware on the map. Like the older forms of crypto malware, Cryptolocker is placed on your machine, and it will look for your files on your machine and it's going to encrypt them. But what makes this different is it targets usually business files. Most commonly, it's going to look for anything that could be business data. So that includes things like Word documents, PDFs, Excels, databases, and even image files and things like CAD files. Now, Cryptolocker was pretty much the first crypto malware example that used strong industry-grade encryption. If you're not able to get the private key information that was used to encrypt your files, there really is little to no chance you will ever recover your files. Now, about 8 months ago, there was a couple of security researchers that managed to hijack a few command and control servers that were being used by the ransomware creators. And in doing so, they were able to gain access to a large number of private keys used by early variants of Cryptolocker. There are now a number of online tools and utilities that have access to those databases. So if you do get an early variant of Cryptolocker, you could potentially use these tools to find your private key and uncrypt your data. But as I said, it does only work on the very early variants of Cryptolocker. Another thing which made Cryptolocker so successful was how it called back home to the command and control server. Ransomware requires a command and control server in order to call home to begin its encryption process. Now, early examples of Cryptolocker would call home to a single command and control server that was hosted by a single domain name behind a single IP address. This method makes it a lot easier for authorities to locate these servers. The harder it is for authorities to find these command and control servers, the more successful the malware would be. Nowadays, Cryptolocker uses what we call DGA, and this stands for Domain Generation Algorithm. So instead of having a single domain or a single URL that Cryptolocker would use to call home, now the malware is able to use a mathematical algorithm to randomly generate a number of domain names it could use to call home. And these would change every single day. With the malware creator knowing the algorithm, they know which domain names to use every minute of every day in order for the malware to call home. The algorithm would create thousands of domain names, but the malware creator would only register the domain names that were going to be used at those specific times, and only for the window of time it was going to be used for. This means that it's almost impossible for security vendors to ever really know which domain names are hosting the command and control servers, meaning that they can't block them. Another feature which makes Cryptolocker so successful was its payment methods. Typically, you would receive a pop-up window, just like the ones in the example on this slide, where you would see a message that your files have been encrypted, and you now have 72 hours in which to pay the fine or face losing the data permanently. Being able to actually see the clock counting down really hits you with a sense of urgency. And this alone makes Cryptolocker very, very successful, as people are much more likely to pay. Cryptolocker, it comes in many different shapes and sizes, but typically they all use the same payment method, which we call Bitcoin. If you haven't heard of Bitcoin before, it's basically an online digital currency which allows users to send money and transact directly without the need of an intermediary. Now, these payment methods is probably the favorite choice used by the malware creators, as the transactions are very difficult to trace. Although you can see the transaction logs, the users are anonymous. And it makes it easy for malware producers to claim their prize money, if you like, without actually being caught. In some other examples, you might see payment methods using things like PayPal pay cards. Now, these transactions are traceable, and they come with a much higher risk. Therefore, you would tend to see a much higher ransom being demanded if they choose to use things like PayPal, because they're likely to get caught and the funds are likely to get confiscated. Right, okay. In 2014, we began to see a large number of Cryptolocker copycats. Now, these copies were things such as TorLocker and VirusWall, and they would still encrypt the files on your machine, or perhaps encrypt your drive, but they didn't use as strong encryption methods as Cryptolocker. However, there was one piece of ransomware which did do very well, and that's CryptoWall. So it was first seen in 2014, and a lot of people get this mixed up with Cryptolocker, but CryptoWall is quite different. It does have a number of similarities to Cryptolocker, one being that it uses very strong encryption, so it uses 2048-bit RSA encryption, which makes it, again, almost impossible to crack. CryptoWall looks for a much larger amount of files compared to Cryptolocker. So, for example, this malware is now capable of reaching and encrypting any network shares that may be mapped to your machine. So not only is it going to encrypt the important documents on your local machine, but it's going to also encrypt all the business critical information stored on your network drives. Now, with these files encrypted, CryptoWall could potentially shut down your business, making it, a very serious piece of malware. Not only is CryptoWall going to encrypt these drives, but it's now also going to go as far as encrypting files which are hosted on online services, things like Dropbox. It's actually going to reach into your Dropbox folder and encrypt those files too. So this is a very serious piece of malware. Now, at the later part of 2014, we saw the release of Cryptolocker version 2. This release very cleverly uses a Tor-based web browser connection to allow you to anonymously pay. So you would usually see clear instructions on how to install Tor to your machine and a step-by-step guide on how you would set it up and connect to their website in order to make the Bitcoin payment. Now, all of that is all done anonymously. With some of the less successful ransomwares we've seen, they would use a technique that takes your original file and it would it'll create an encrypted copy of that file, and then it deletes the original file. That's typically how the older ransomwares would work. Now, the problem with this method is that most operating systems, when you delete a file, you don't actually remove the data from the disk. So this means that you could potentially recover the files using some undelete software. However, with Cryptolocker version 2, what it's going to do is take your file, it's going to create that encrypted version of the file, but then it's going to very cleverly write it back to the disk exactly over the top of your original file. So this means that the original files are lost forever. Now, Cryptolocker version 3. With this comes better techniques for evading malware detection. And this is done by using what we call a dropper. A dropper file, its job is a small tool which can be downloaded to your machine to interrogate your machine to see if you have any antivirus running, to see what other network security services you might be using, to check for any vulnerabilities. And then if it believes your machine is susceptible to this malware, it's then going to instruct the malware to download to your machine. Now, the dropper file itself, these are very successful at being downloaded because they are able to disguise themselves as legitimate files. So, for example, it might look like a PNG image file, but actually it's an executable file. Another successful technique used is called repackaging. Now, in essence, you take the copy of your malware and you run it through a repackaging utility. The malware will still look and it will still function in exactly the same way, but what this utility is going to do is it's going to re-jumble up all the ones and all the zeros to make the data of the malware look very different. So I'm sure we're all aware of how antivirus works, using signatures to detect malware. Well, the AV vendor creates a signature to block that specific variant of malware. All the malware creator needs to do is repack the file, and because the data of the file now looks different, that AV signature will no longer detect that variant. It's quite common to see different variants of malware being produced every couple of hours, and there is no way any AV vendor can identify the malware, create and deploy the signature for it in that period of time. There's another difference as well, actually, between Cryptolocker and Cryptolocker, in that they would both present you with a 72-hour window in which to pay off that ransom. But after 72 hours, Cryptolocker deletes your private key, and then your data is basically lost forever. Where Cryptolocker, after 72 hours, it's gonna keep your key, but what it's going to do is increase the amount you need to pay. Now, by doing this, they give people a longer period of time to pay, which in turn makes this a much more successful variant of ransomware, with the amount of people who would eventually cave in and pay for that ransom. I just want to touch on this as well. So mobile variants, we are beginning to see malware and ransomware arrive on our mobile devices. And the first one I want to talk about is one that we saw back in 2014. It only affected a very small amount of iPhone users, and it turned out that it was actually a pretend ransomware anyway. So basically, somebody managed to compromise the iCloud servers used by Apple, and in doing so, they gained access to a number of user credentials. Now, it's thought that the breach only managed to leak something like 5,000 credentials maximum. Once the hacker had the credentials, they then went to work on creating a new lock screen message that would be seen by the user, and it was threatening them that they were going to install ransomware on their phone. And it gave them instructions on how to pay a small ransom to prevent this from happening. Now, this was delivered using the messaging system within the Find My Phone app in iCloud. Now, the thing is, there wasn't really any malware installed. I mean, you were still able to unlock your phone and use your phone quite normally. You just had this really annoying message on your lock screen. Now, assuming the hacker hadn't changed your iCloud password, you could just log back in and change your password and remove the message from the Find My Phone app. So there really wasn't any malware installed, but it certainly did lead people to believe that there was. And then we move on to scareware. So scareware, which had been aimed basically at Android users. So you could be browsing online from your device and you may receive some kind of pop-up notification saying that you are required to do a security update or maybe a flash update or something like that. And it's going to try and get you to load an APK file, which is an Android installer file. Now the APK file would of course be the malware. And this variant of malware is a type of lock screen malware. So what it's going to do is it's going to use a number of tricks to kill any and all processes running on your phone. So if you open up a browser, you would see instructions on how you can pay the ransom. But if you try to navigate away and browse to a different website, the browser will close. If you try to use any other application or any other feature on your phone, again, it would just close it. So like with some of the Cryptolocker and the Cryptable variants, we also begin to see localization of this malware device ransomware, where it's going to create an authority theme or choosing the correct language specifically on the country that this malware was targeted at. Now with this malware, there are ways to get around this, but it does involve you having to kind of like boot your device into safe mode. I think you might even need to root it in order to do it. There are some instructions online, step-by-step guides which will explain how to get rid of this. But certainly if you're an Android user like myself, it could certainly be a bit of a pain. Okay, so let's summarize the evolution of the ransomware. So we are seeing a greater number of different file types becoming targeted by ransomware, including documents, movies, and image files. Actually, another quick note on this is that we've also seen a variant of ransomware called TeslaCrypt. And this one's brilliant. I love it. TeslaCrypt, what it does is it targets specifically online gamers. So that's the people who use applications such as Steam or play games like Minecraft or World of Warcraft. And what it's going to do is it's going to encrypt your saved game data and your game-related files. So if you imagine that you've probably invested a whole lot of time and tons of money in a particular game like World of Warcraft, you potentially stand to lose all of it unless you pay the ransom. I think that one's brilliant. Another trend that we're seeing in ransomware is that it's no longer targeting local files on your machine, but it's also going to be looking for network shares and online cloud file sharing services like Dropbox. We're seeing uncrackable RSA encryption. We're seeing ransomware now overwriting the original files, so there's no way of recovering them. We're also seeing better encryption techniques and also better evading, better ways of evading detection. So AV vendors, they're not going to be able to catch this variant of malware on day one. It's going to take them days or weeks to write that signature to block that malware, by which time, of course, you could have received the malware. We're also beginning to see the use of Tor to anonymize the connections back to the website for the hosting for the payment. And then finally, we're also seeing something called freemium sites. Now, this is really clever. What this does is it allows you to browse to the ransomware site where they will let you have some of your files back for free. Now, by doing this, it kind of demonstrates to you that the system does work, and if you pay the ransom, you will receive your files back again. But of course, there is absolutely no guarantee that you will receive anything back. They could just take your money and run. So that's really it for the evolution of malware. So let's move on to what we can do and what we all need to be doing to try and prevent ransomware from from making it onto our devices and onto our network. Now, really, there are three basic steps that we can all take. There's the preparation, there's prevention, and there's response. Firstly, I think it really comes down to education. So ransomware, it spreads using common techniques such as file attachments or phishing websites. So you may receive something like a UPS invoice document over email, or you may be browsing what you think is a legitimate website, but in fact you've been redirected to a phishing site where they can push something to your machine. Or maybe, you've clicked on a link and it's just downloaded what you think is a legitimate file. Maybe it's a flash update pop-up or something like that, or a security patch. It could be many, many things. So the user thinks it's safe and legitimate to do so. But what we need to be doing is making sure that our users are aware of these techniques. We need to actually tell them that clicking on these file attachments or clicking these links in these emails or pop-up windows, that it can download malware such as this. Now, most users, I think, are completely unaware that this type of malware even exists. So we just need to try and educate our users the best we can. And you know what? It's not only the users who need to be trained. I think also our IT teams do too. It's important, I think, that our IT administrators not only know and understand how the malware works, but also how it can be delivered to the network. And most importantly, how they need to configure their security services and appliances to prevent such content from being able to come down to their network. And then there's patching. A lot of tricks the bad guys use to install malware takes advantage of known vulnerabilities on your system. In fact, approximately 90% of the malware delivery kits used in the wild are old, and they use old vulnerabilities to gain access to your systems. So literally, by simply keeping your systems up to date and patched regularly, you could prevent a vast amount of malware from being downloaded to your systems. Then finally, and I think this is the most important step, this is what ransomware such as Cryptolocker and Cryptoball has taught us, and that is that you need to back up regularly. Most larger organizations do back up their data, but this really is something that all businesses should be doing today. These days, it isn't expensive to purchase either an on-premise or a cloud solution backup service. And it's certainly a lot cheaper to use one of these services than it would be to try and recover the data lost by ransomware. Now, I just want to give you a quick example of this. I spoke to an IT administrator recently, and this guy, I feel bad for him. He had been hit by Cryptowall 3 times in 1 year. And in one of those hits, all of their accounting data was lost. Now, they did have backups, but unfortunately, the backups were not recent enough. And it took their accounting department 8 weeks to re-input all of that missing data. Now, just think about the amount of time wasted where the accounts department could not do their everyday job, until that data was recovered. And financially, that's a lot of money having to pay everyone in that department for 8 weeks to do the job again that they had already previously done. It's cheaper to prevent the infection than it is to fix it afterwards. Now, this example also brings to me my next point, which is that you may be backing up, but how often? It's not uncommon for IT teams to not monitor the backups probably as much as they should be. It's kind of running there in the background, and you just sort of assume it's still doing what it's supposed to be doing. And I think the day-to-day running of our roles probably distracts us from checking that the backups are actually still running. Backing up everything is every bit as important as preventing the malware from getting through in the first place. If you back up every day and you get ransomware, you can simply restore your backup, and hopefully you would only have lost a minimal amount of data. Let's face it, if you don't back up, what's the alternative? Do you pay the ransom? And if you do pay, can you actually guarantee me that you're going to receive your private key back again? So let's move on to how we might prevent malware, such as ransomware. Now, the good news is that if you are running things like antivirus, then some variants of malware are going to get blocked, but these are likely going to be the older variants. AV is designed to protect you against malware, but in order to do so, it must have been seen before, and signatures would need to be created and downloaded to your machine. Now, the bad news is that almost all current malware, it's repackaged very frequently, too frequently for the AV vendor to be able to create that signature to block them. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of malware can be repackaged and redistributed within a couple of hours. The difference in time from the malware being distributed and the AV vendor creating the signature is called the window of vulnerability. Now, this is a window of time that your systems are susceptible to that piece of malware. And this window in time could be days, it could even be weeks before the AV vendor eventually catches up. So this example here, which we sent up to VirusTotal, shows that at the time of uploading this piece of ransomware, only one vendor detected it. And I don't know about you, but I've never heard of that vendor before. But what's interesting is only 1 out of 54 vendors detected it. So, there's some big names in that list. You've got Trend, Kaspersky, Sophos, Avast, AVG, all the big AV vendors are in that list. None of the big guys found this piece of ransomware that we uploaded. So the fact is, antivirus is no longer an effective method of protection. You need something that can proactively protect you. And that proactive service is what we would call an advanced persistent threat service. Now, knowing that in order to block the advanced malware, you need to see it, what this does is it runs a full system emulation known as a sandbox. Now, a sandbox is a safe environment that runs an operating system like Windows or Android, for example, where the file attachments can be run. Now, whenever the system receives these files, whether it's a Word file or a PDF or an exe, it's going to run them in a fully emulated system as if it was actually running on the victim's machine. And then as it runs these files, it analyzes their behavior, to see what it does. Is it trying to install a service? Is it trying to encrypt any files? Is it trying to call home to a command and control server? There's loads of different examples, Is the file trying to evade being detected by sleeping? And in some examples, there's also things like, is it trying to morph into a different file type? So, this malware is very, very clever. Now, once the sandbox has run the file and it's detected suspicious behavior, we can then proactively choose to block that file. Another interesting fact for you is that most malware is clever enough to try to avoid being detected. By analyzing the environment, specifically, it's going to see if it's running in some kind of virtualized sandbox environment. Now, some sandbox services are fairly easy to detect, and that is because they use software emulation on their sandboxes. The malware can detect this, and then it can morph itself into something different to try and evade being detected. Now, the sandbox system we use here at WatchGuard are ones that emulate full systems, and this includes hardware. So these are not virtualized sandboxes. This makes it significantly harder for malware to be detected, for malware to detect, making it much more accurate and successful service. Now, you really need a service like APT Blocker these days protecting your network, as older methods such as antivirus really do not stand up to the test of time, and they simply cannot protect you from modern malware. Now, if you are an existing WatchGuard customer and you are not already running the APT Blocker, you can download a free 30-day trial of this service to your device so you can see for yourself how effective it is. All you need to do is you can apply for the trial under the My Products section of your online WatchGuard account. Simply click on the the device listed within my products, and you will be able to see any trials that are eligible for you for any security services that we offer, including the APT blocker. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the response then. So one of the things you can do is actively monitor and block known command and control server sites. So almost all ransomware these days requires a call home in order to, get the private key information so it can begin its encryption process. Simply blocking the known command and control servers will prevent that from happening. So if you download the ransomware, if it can't call home, then it can't cause any damage. And again, if you're an existing WatchGuard customer, then you may already be aware of our web blocker service. You would typically use this service to block access to web categories, so things like adult material, perhaps you block gambling or news, that kind of thing. But what you may not realize is there is also a category in there specifically for blocking known command and control servers. So simply blocking this category could prevent the ransomware from being able to activate. Also, a small side note whilst we're here, I would actually advise that you block every subcategory under the security heading, as every category within there are things that you would want to block. So for example, malware sites. Again, if you block the malware site to begin with, then this might prevent your users from even being able to download the ransomware in the first place. So it's worth noting that the WebLocker database, it's also the largest database, or one of, should I say, the largest databases in the world. And something you probably didn't realize is it's updated every 5 minutes. So if a new compromised website or a new malicious website or command and control server is detected, within 5 minutes, every WatchGuard customer in the world knows about it too. So this is a really very effective way of preventing not only the download of the malware, but also the malware being able to call home to activate. And finally, the response. We would really advise that you don't pay the ransom. I mean, you should be keeping up, backups of your data and even perhaps snapshots of your server. The thing is about paying is that once you've paid, you're effectively helping to finance a criminal activity. But most importantly, and I stress this point, there is absolutely no guarantee that you will ever see your private key or your files again. We've seen on the news numbers of businesses and authorities admitting that they have had to pay the ransom to get their data back, which I think is kind of interesting because our governments do claim to not negotiate with terrorists, but then they are willing to pay some kind of ransom to get their data back, which I kind of find a little bit baffling and confusing. Also, a survey was recently done with a number of security administrators, and you may be surprised to see that 30% agreed that they would pay the ransom to get their data back. Now, I'm guessing these are the guys who do not yet have a backup solution, or they probably don't have a security solution in place that can prevent the ransomware from coming in. Now, obviously, we can't tell you guys what to do, but we would advise against paying the ransom where possible. Instead, why not proactively spend that money on something like an advanced persistent threat scanner, like our APT blocker? Prevention is better than cure. That's certainly my motto. Now, when we talk about defense in depth, what we're saying here is that you need multiple layers of security to protect yourself and to prevent malware such as ransomware from getting through. And that's because there isn't just one way you may get infected. There are many different ways that you might become infected. So you need multiple services running in harmony to protect you. So you need a firewall, and that's going to lock down your inbound and outbound ports. You're going to need an intrusion prevention service to block inbound connections that are trying to take advantage of known vulnerabilities. And you're going to need something like an APT blocker to catch the malware that's trying to evade detection and bypass your AV. You need all of these services running together in order to be sure that you have done all you can in an effort to prevent advanced malware like Cryptolocker from getting onto your network. So we often talk about a kill chain and what's involved in order for an attacker to be able to get the malware through to your machine. And I find these things quite interesting. So first off, there's reconnaissance, where the attacker will target a specific audience, whether that's local authority or online gamers, small, medium businesses, that kind of thing. And then we have delivery. How are they going to push the malware to your machine? Is it going to be an email attachment via a pop-up window or a phishing website? Then you've got the exploit itself, where it's going to take advantage of perhaps a found vulnerability, and then that's going to allow it to install the malware to your machine. It's going to have to call home to the command and control server to begin the encryption process. And you know what? Perhaps it's then going to probably move around inside your business, infecting multiple systems. And then finally, it achieves its job, whether that's to steal your data, to lock your machine, encrypt everything, or demand a ransom. Now, the important thing to think about when we're examining a kill chain is that you need multiple defenses at each link of the chain. Now, WatchGuard offers all of the required security services every step of the way by offering best-of-breed security vendors in one easy-to-use, single pane of glass UTM firewall solution. So, for example, reconnaissance. Our proxy technology may detect perhaps a non-RFC compliant HTTP header command that's trying to automatically download malware to your machine, and then it's going to block it. And then just look at the delivery link. There's 7 different security features that the WatchGuard could use to detect ransomware as it tries to pass through. It could use our proxy technology. Maybe it's going to get blocked by web blocker or application control. The intrusion prevention might see them trying to take advantage of a vulnerability. The advanced persistent threat scanner might pick it up and use it. AV could pick it up, as I said, if it's an older variant. And we're also going to reputation scan all of the source IPs that you connect to. So if it's a bad reputation, we're going to block it too. You know, perhaps it's picked up at the vulnerability stage where either the intrusion prevention or the AV or the APT blocker detects the attacker trying to get through. Now, it is possible that just one feature will detect the malware. And you know what? If it does, great, good job. But it's likely that almost every feature will detect it. So hopefully this diagram shows you that not only do you need multiple security features, but you need them every step of the way as you go through the kill chain. Now, we're able to provide you with all of these different layers of security by integrating best-of-breed security vendors in one solution. And we offer, world-leading technologies from companies such as Sophos and Trend, WebSense, which is then Reveton, which is then ForcePoint, I think they're called today, Lastline, AVG. So there's a whole bunch of industry-leading vendors in the solution. And not forgetting, of course, Lastline, who do our APT blocker and their sandbox technology. So all of these vendors seamlessly plug into our patent proxy technology, providing a bulletproof, secure, high-performing security appliance. And that's it. I hope you found it useful and informative. I can see that we've got a whole ton of questions here, but I'm pretty much out of time. So if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is take those questions offline and I will respond back to you later on today. Guys, thanks for joining and I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to speaking to you again real soon. Take care.